Welcome to Plugged In, Exploring Energy, a podcast miniseries with Constellation, where we explore the evolving landscape of energy solutions. In each episode, we bring industry leaders and experts to discuss the latest innovations, challenges, and opportunities in the energy sector. Welcome back to Plugged In. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking with Brian Smith, Director, Nuclear Reactor Development from the Idaho National Laboratory. Brian, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Chuck. It's great being here with you.
Let's jump right in and maybe start with your background and the work you do at INL, if you would, please, Brian, so you can share with our listening audience today.
Yeah, sure. I think of myself as a career federal employee. My move over to Idaho National Laboratory only occurred about a year ago. It was January of 25. When I moved to the laboratory, I retired from the Department of Energy, but I got my start in government as an active duty officer in the Navy. While in uniform, I was assigned to the Naval Nuclear Propulsion Program in Washington, D.C. And, it was the Navy that taught me how to spell nuclear. There's really no one else in the world, frankly, that does nuclear as well as the U.S. Nuclear Navy. All of our submarines and aircraft carriers are powered by nuclear reactors. So I kind of came of age in the defense nuclear side of the business, became a civilian, a federal civilian in that program when I transitioned off of active duty, joined the leadership team in the civilian capacity with naval reactors, moved over to the National Nuclear Security Administration, also as part of the leadership team over there. I went over to the House Appropriations Committee, where I was the Department of Energy's appropriator on all of their nuclear programs, both defense and non-defense. Went back to the Department of Energy. In my last role there, I was acting as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Nuclear Reactors. And then, like I said, just in January of 25, earlier this year, retired from my federal government roles and moved over to the Department of Energy-owned Idaho National Laboratory. So it's been a fun ride, and the move over to the laboratory was really a short leap. The strategy remains the same. The excitement around nuclear means it's kind of all hands on deck to accelerate the deployments of advanced nuclear technologies. And whether in my federal jersey or now in my, contractor jersey, but working at a national laboratory, it's exciting times, and I've really had a fun ride.
Brian, thanks so much for sharing your background. Very impressive, and thank you for your service. And then also congrats on the recent Navy win over Army over last weekend, which was a great game to watch, as we talked about earlier.
It is. It's good football.
So INL works at the intersection of energy innovation and national security. And you've been in the middle of this, just as you described, with your diverse background across many facets of this area. So what do you see as the most urgent challenge the U.S. is facing in building resilient, low-carbon energy solutions?
Yeah, what a great question. And geez, we could probably plan ourselves on that topic for a week-long seminar. I'll go back to that word I used, excitement. I mean, there is a lot of opportunity out there, and there is what I think is a very unique opportunity for advanced nuclear technologies. There's a need for more power on the grid in the U.S. I think that's not a secret to anybody. A big part of those load growth projections, as we look out in the future over the next 3, 5, 10 years, it's that hockey stick look that load growth represents. And nuclear is very well suited. And in fact, I think there's a case to be made that nuclear is best suited to meet those load growth projections. But as we look at advanced nuclear technologies, and, for that, you start talking about small modular reactors or SMRs and micro reactors, advanced nuclear technologies that present unique and very different use cases from large scale reactors, those gigawatt sized reactors that are critically important to today's grid in this country. I mean, there's 94 operating reactors. They put almost 20% of the power on the U.S. electric grid. So there's an important role that nuclear plays today. Heck, with those 94 reactors, there's ongoing work to do what we call uprate reactors. That's where you can actually get more power out of an operating reactor. Those efforts, supported by underpinning research programs at Idaho National Laboratory and elsewhere through the laboratory system. I mean, those programs are supporting putting gigawatts more power on the grid from that operating fleet. So that's good news. And that's exciting. That is ongoing work. But then the accelerating the deployment of small modular reactors and micro reactors with all of these other use cases. We could talk more about those siting opportunities, maybe siting a small modular reactor in a place where you can't build a large scale reactor. That's a great opportunity for maybe it's not even power on the grid. Maybe that's power in a remote environment. I spend time in Alaska, talking to communities in Alaska, certainly the governor in Alaska, the legislature, very interested in SMRs and micro reactors and what that presents for them in remote areas. So there's just a lot of conversation with a lot of different industries that have power and frankly, heat needs for industries that use heat. That means there's a lot of conversations to be had around the country and around the world with our friends, like-minded partners on how they can leverage advanced nuclear and how they can do that as quickly as possible.
And then, you've shared I would describe it as very unique and broad background across many facets of this. How is INL enabling the commercialization process for these solutions for deployment to customers? If you could share your insights on that.
Yeah, again, another great question. And the commercialization piece is really critical to discuss here. When I travel around the world and I talk about the wonderful things that Idaho National Laboratory is doing to help accelerate the deployment of advanced nuclear technologies, bear in mind, Idaho National Lab, it's one of 17 U.S. national laboratories. That national laboratory system is very unique in the world. And the corpus of work undertaken by the national laboratories really is critical for virtually every facet of research and development, cutting edge research and development done in this country. Idaho National Lab happens to be the lead lab for nuclear energy, research, development, demonstration. And so this decade at INL, we'll be partnering, we are partnering with private industry, nuclear reactor developers that are piloting their first reactors, building and turning on those first reactors at the laboratory. We've got unique testbed facilities. We've got unique laboratory capabilities to help de-risk technology programs when we partner with those private reactor developers. We bring, just like the rest of the national labs, but in this case with nuclear technologies, we bring these unique capabilities and over 6,000 of the world's most talented scientists and engineers to de-risk those programs. And then we provide the physical infrastructure and land for these developers to build their first reactors. That's important. Those ongoing activities, those are happening this decade. We'll start turning on advanced reactors at INL next year in 2026. So that's good. And that's an important step in commercialization. Now, turning on a pilot reactor at INL, is that commercialization? Well, no, it's not. But you have to turn on the first one before you turn on the next 100, right? And so by partnering with private industry, providing the facilities, the technical reach back capability to these private developers, and letting them build, facilitating their first deployment at the laboratory, we can play an important role in helping those private developers then take that demonstrated capability, that demonstrated technology. They can then engage with the investor community, line up the rest of the business stakeholders to go deploy those technologies at scale to commercialize, right? So while turning on a reactor at INL isn't commercialization, you have to do that first one to achieve the scalability.
So as you talked about some of the applications in terms of location, whether it may be limited or remote, for SMRs and some of the examples you used. Can you share how you see things evolving over time in terms of how the SMRs will develop over time in terms of the broader market, particularly as you look out, call it 5 to 10 years into the future?
Yeah, sure. And, it's funny, especially as I sat on the defense nuclear side of the business for so many years. Let me go back 10 plus years as Small modular reactors, they're all the rage now. It's what folks want to talk about, but the idea is not new. Certainly the idea of, frankly, taking a page out of the nuclear Navy's playbook, building smaller reactors, primarily in effect. The nuclear Navy, we build our reactors in Lynchburg, Virginia. They're factory built, they're shipped out to the shipyard and put into the submarine as part of the ship build program. So the idea is not new. But today, when we talk about the evolving use cases, it is a little bit different than what has been talked about, say, 10 plus years ago. Small modular reactors tend to be thought of as something grid facing primarily, but their smaller size and their factory fabrication meant that there was cost predictability kind of inherent in the program. You could do so much in a factory, then deploy these things mostly assembled, fabricated and assembled, deploy them on site. That narrows the cone of uncertainty around the cost and schedule to deploy. That's good. And if you're doing that at, say, 300 megawatts at a time, well, heck, maybe then you're deploying, 3 of those in a grid-facing configuration. You're achieving that, getting to that gigawatt scale, that 1,000 megawatt scale that is comparable to the large scale reactors today. But instead of embarking on a very large complex construction project for that single large scale reactor, you're deploying, say, 300 megawatts at a time in a very cost and schedule predictable manner. Okay, so that is a very traditional use case for SMRs. And frankly, I think it's an exquisite use case. There's a lot to that. But where we are today and the conversations I have with folks, let's talk about, those data center developers again. Data center developers are looking for powered land. Their constraint used to be fiber. They were going to where the fiber was, and they were figuring out the energy piece kind of as a second tier of their considerations. But it was all about going where fiber is. Northern Virginia has been the place to build data centers because it's the hub. It's one of the hubs for the internet. But today, it's less about fiber, in part because there has been so much fiber build out over the last 20 years. Now it's all about power. And so in the conversations I have with data center developers, they say, hey, Brian, I got the fiber piece figured out, and I want to build in Dallas, or I want to build in Columbus, Ohio. I want to build in Phoenix. What I need is power, and I need power now. And in some cases, they're saying, hey, look, I don't even know that I want to be grid connected. I want an SMR right outside my data center, and I want that very reliable, resilient power from the SMR. I'm happy to have those conversations. At We at INL, again, we've got, research programs on how you don't just plug a data center into a nuclear reactor and turn it on and call it good. Power management matters no matter your energy source. Managing the load transients inherent to AI, those are complex challenges, and we're solving those at the lab. But it is interesting that today, those applications of siting scenarios are on people's mind where they're not necessarily thinking of a grid-facing asset, but they're saying, hey, if I can bring my own power, and even if I'm grid islanded, that doesn't concern me. And, those configurations, they're all over the map. It's fun to talk about it. Some folks say, hey, I'm always going to be grid connected. I want that backup, but I want my nuclear reactor to be my primary. Or they say, hey, look, I'm going to build a natural gas plant. I wanted an SMR so I can achieve full redundancy. I'll probably have a ring of diesel generators around the data center too, because I simply can't go down. I've got to have full uptime. So lots of conversations to be had. I'm agnostic on what makes sense. Your listeners have probably heard me identify one of those deployment scenarios and said, that's never going to happen. Fair enough. But hey, look, if someone wants to have the conversation and engage with the laboratory on how we can further tailor those research programs to those industry desires, we're all about it.
So we talked about, this high growth, a lot of it through data center, other large loads, as you shared. And then you've talked about how INL provides these pilots to kind of prove out the technology, touched on SMRs. What's kind of the next step that INL and you are involved with beyond the piloting to expand the deployment of these technologies, whether it's SMR or others, to make them more available and commercialized to the scale that we need to meet the demands of these large loads that are upon us?
Yeah, that gets back to that very good topic of commercializing. Let's step back for a moment and think about the role of the national labs. Again, as I've said, I'm a big fan of the national labs and the important role that they play in providing underpinning research and development in this country. Traditionally, the national labs haven't been called on to think about the way to commercialize those technologies. There have been times where that's been a little bit more a thing than other times. But traditionally, the laboratories kind of have a great role to play. And I think of the valley of death we often talk about. The universities in this country do a wonderful job at developing blue sky ideas and doing research and kind of the left end of the spectrum of going from concept to commercial ability. The labs then can come in the middle, kind of pick up some of that blue sky research and carry it through the valley of death and sort of hand off more developed technologies to the commercial sector, private industry, so that they can go deploy and commercialize. I always thought of it as, okay, so the labs can refine technologies and put them on the doorstep so that the private industry can pick them up and commercialize. With nuclear technologies, I think we're looking past that in the laboratory system, certainly at INL, to assist the Department of Energy, again, being a DOE-owned lab. This is tightly coordinated from the administration and our congressional stakeholders all the way through the laboratory to figure out how we can work more deliberately with industry. We, the laboratory, I'll take myself as an example, having this conversation, getting out to your listeners and talking about the things that the laboratory is doing. This helps spread the message to developers that we are out there actively partnering with industry and not just nuclear developers. There's an ongoing program led by the Department of Energy to site data centers, AI data centers on federal lands, including Idaho National Laboratory, co-located with energy producing technologies, including nuclear and geothermal. That kind of targeted, thoughtful, deliberate engagement with industry, partnership with industry, I would tell you that goes a step beyond what we, the lab, have historically done. I think traditionally we would have assisted in demonstrating some of these advanced technologies, then let the free market in this country kind of do what it does. That's traditionally how new technologies get commercialized in this country. But I think with nuclear and there's some other parts of the energy ecosystem where I think we're actively working on this. Geothermal comes to mind. But that more targeted, deliberate engagement with industry to get in the middle of the discussions, serving as a matchmaker of sorts, being in the room and at the table with a hyperscaler and a nuclear developer and helping them understand each other's language, each other's equities, throw the utility in the mix, throw the regulators in the mix, FERC, the NRC. There's a lot of different equities and stakeholders that need to come together to de-risk these technologies and to make them palatable to a free market enterprise. The laboratories can serve as kind of a lubricant in that process. And we're actively doing that, again, in full partnership and coordination with our owners at the Department of Energy.
Very impressive. So we've talked about some of the technologies like the nearer term around uprates at existing nuclear facilities, the development, deployment of new technologies around SMR as an example. You mentioned also geothermal as another technology, and then how the DOE and the INL are also collaborating with industry and partnerships to enable it, both in terms of putting various teams and organizations together and then providing federal land. How about, some of the other areas of this around energy, securitization, cybersecurity, and the overall grid modernization approach? How does all that fit into a lot of the commercialization activities that you're involved with? Could you share your insights around that as well? Because that's obviously a big part of this in terms of how we manage the security around the new infrastructure that needs to be built.
Yeah, no doubt about it. I know I keep coming across as a cheerleader of sorts for the National Laboratory System, but it's fair here. In as far as, for example, Idaho National Laboratory is the lead lab for nuclear energy research, development, and demonstration, as I've mentioned. That's not the only thing that the laboratory does. We have a substantial ongoing engagement across the federal government even beyond the Department of Energy to include for example, the Department of Homeland Security, which has a role to play, obviously, in grid security, cybersecurity, those cybersecurity equities that play into ensuring a safe, reliable grid across this country. I mentioned 6,000 of the world's brightest scientists and engineers, perhaps no surprise that we'd have a lot of folks engaged in those energy issues. So while we have a nuclear science and technology directorate, which is where I happen to work at Idaho National Laboratory, we do have an entire directorate devoted to those homeland security issues, grid security, cybersecurity, frankly, classified programs that do some amazing things. I was a little more tightly coordinated with those things when I sat in the House of Representatives on the appropriations staff with oversight of those programs. So that remains important as transmission build out continues to occur in this country, as grid upgrades of actual infrastructure and component upgrades occur in this country, as we consider sourcing for those components to manage the build out of the grid. Those issues, we have to not only maintain our oversight and awareness of the technologies, where those technologies are being sourced, how they're being developed, what countries are partnering to develop those technologies. We not only have to maintain that awareness, I think, frankly, we need to lean in a bit more on that. And I will tell you, that is a sentiment shared by our congressional stakeholders, kind of the hyper awareness of how we're partnering in this country, how industry is partnering in this country with international partners. The awareness from congressional stakeholders through the administration and the relevant departments, to include energy, homeland security, and others, all the way then to the National Laboratory Network, where I&L can partner with other national laboratories and bring that full suite of capabilities to bear to make sure that we've got a safe grid as we continue building it out. That is an ongoing effort. Those are things that your listeners can, with a quick Google search, you can find out all the exciting things going on across the laboratory system to really bolster that research.
Yeah, very interesting. So thanks so much for sharing your insights. And as we wrap up here, just a couple of comments, and I want to solicit input from you and other areas we may have missed or not covered today, but appreciate your leadership, both in terms of INL and you personally around, how you're piloting these technologies, collaborating across the various industry and other partners to enable further collaboration, both in terms of the technology side, but also in terms of the land development that you cited, and then how we maintain the security as this part of the data economy continues to grow. So any other areas that we haven't touched on that you'd like to share with your listeners?
I think one thing maybe I'd just like to sort of foot stomp, we did touch on it, but I get asked a lot of, I speak to a lot of groups around the world, and I get asked a lot of times, hey, Brian, all the things you say about nuclear are exciting, but when's nuclear going to be real? Is it still, 10 or 15, 20 years off? And I say, wait a minute, what do you mean when's nuclear going to be real? I mean, it's 20% of what's on the grid today, 94 operating reactors. So I do think sometimes people lose sight of the fact that nuclear, and those two reactors most recently deployed down in Georgia at the Vogtle plant, Vogtle 3 and 4, as we call them, those are advanced reactors. I mean, that AP1000 Westinghouse design is an advanced reactor. So advanced nuclear is real. And there's an opportunity for large-scale grid-facing reactors. Overcost and behind schedule is something that we can get at by building now. I think the administration is leaning in on that. I think there's going to be a lot more to come on that just in the coming months. So I'd encourage your listeners to kind of stay abreast of what's going on new build, large scale nuclear construction. There are other countries around this world that are doing that well, and they're doing it well and driving down the cost curve and narrowing the cone of uncertainty, because they're building these complex projects over and over, and you simply get better at doing it. So I just want to foot stomp that piece. And I think all of that then provides a really nice jumping off point to those use cases, unique use cases for small modular and micro reactors to be deployed for high heat industries, desalination, hydrogen production in places around the world, not necessarily traditional grid facing energy producing assets, which they can be as well. So it's exciting times. Again, we're doing so much this decade. It's all hands on deck to make sure the 2030s are set up for just a lot more activity in this area.
Yeah, that's great. So just to wrap up again, Brian, thanks so much for being with us. Appreciate you sharing your insights, the leadership INL and you are providing. And it was interesting to learn about the technology deployment and development into the future. But I think your last point, I took very detailed notes from our discussion today. I wrote down nuclear now. Let's not forget about nuclear now as part of what's keeping this grid modernized and safe, reliable, and carbon free. So thank you again for joining us. I know we got a lot out of it in terms of our listeners and very much appreciate you being with us today.
Thank you, Chuck. I appreciate the collaboration and getting the message out. Thanks for what you do.
This is Deborah Channel from Smart Energy Decisions. We're really thrilled to have Constellation as part of Smart Energy Voices. I want to thank Chuck Hanna and the team from Constellation for making this miniseries possible. And as always, thank you to our listeners for being part of the Smart Energy Decisions community. If you enjoyed the episode, you can subscribe to the podcast on your preferred platform, and don't forget to tell your colleagues and peers about it too. To learn about how you can become part of our online and in-person content, visit our website at smartenergydecisions.com. We're always excited to share these presentations from leaders of the energy transition. We do that in this podcast, on our website, and at our events, and it's all in the interest of helping you make those smart energy decisions.